Lionel Robbins, the British economist, asked in his book, The Great Depression, 1934, why does the economy do this? Why is there what he called a cluster of errors? In other words, businessmen all seem to be doing exactly the right thing during the boom. They're making big sales, everybody's happy, and then it seems like all of a sudden everybody's doing the wrong thing. And he says, there's no reason to expect that that should just happen, so why? Why is it happening? And the customary answer that we've heard an awful lot is that, well, it's because animal spirits are at work in the economy. And there are psychological factors that cause entrepreneurs and businessmen to just to become unduly pessimistic and to pull back for whatever reason. And so we need to just jumpstart the economy again and get it moving. So in other words, psychological explanations have been given. Now, I find these highly unsatisfying. If that really were the case, then we should immediately drop everything and pour all the research money we can into developing a happy drug for investors to prevent them from going into these downturns when they become pessimistic. Give them an optimist drug. That would solve the problem. Well, if you're not convinced that real imbalances in the economy can be explained by mere psychological explanations, then you might be open to alternative theories. And as I say, the Austrian school has an excellent one. Now, let's consider that there is no reason right off the bat to believe that the economy should move like this. Now, it's true, some businesses are going to go out of business. That is unavoidable because we are not perfect forecasters of the future. The future is uncertain. So some businessmen will correctly anticipate consumer demand. Others will do a terrible job and anticipate consumer demand very badly. So what the free market does with its profit and loss system is it weeds out people who stink at this. If you produce products that people consistently do not want to buy, you suffer losses, and if you persist in it, you go out of business altogether. And the capital you were using gets redeployed elsewhere in the economy and is put at the disposal of people who are better at this. So in other words, over time, there is a natural tendency through the profit and loss mechanism to build up a class of business people who are skilled at anticipating consumer demand. So in other words, given that the market weeds out people who are bad at it and selects for people who are good at it, we should all the less expect all of them suddenly to be making the same kind of error in the same direction simultaneously. I mean, this does seem to demand explanation. But again, we hardly ever even get the question asked, much less answered. So Austrian business cycle theory proposes to answer this question: what is causing this boom and bust cycle in the economy? Now, to understand what the Austrians have to say on this subject, let me begin. This is the most academic part, and then it's slightly more fun after this. But we need to look at what an interest rate is supposed to do, why it's valuable. I mean, it's one thing for the government to interfere with the price of milk. If the government sets the price of milk at 10 cents a gallon, only a fool would think, oh, wonderful, that means I'll be able to get milk at 10 cents a gallon. No, it doesn't. It means you'll get no milk at all. Because no one's going to supply it at 10 cents a gallon, and a lot more people are going to demand it. So you're not going to get any. So it's bad enough if the government interferes with that kind of price, one consumer product price. But interest rates permeate the whole economy. So if you interfere with those, you could be introducing systematic discoordination throughout every nook and cranny of the whole economy. So what is it that interest rates are supposed to do when you leave them alone? What function do they serve? Well, they coordinate production across time. They take account of the time dimension that exists in the economy. And so let me give an example of what I'm talking about, and then I'll tie this into interest rates. Imagine Robinson Crusoe on his island, and he's living in isolation. And he hasn't met Friday, so he's living in complete isolation. And let's suppose that he basically spends his time gathering berries to eat in order to sustain himself. Well, let's suppose that he decides that he'd like to vary his diet, and he'd like to catch some fish instead. And in fact, he'll be able to catch fish, he believes. This will not only diversify his diet, but he'll be able to catch more fish than he can gather berries. He'll get more nourishment from the fish. So he decides that he's going to fashion a net for the purpose of catching fish. Well, let's suppose it takes him 3 days. I mean, if any of you saw the movie Castaway, I mean, the project of taking a net would be very time-consuming. If you're the only person, you have no tools. So let's say it's going to take him 3 days to fashion this net. Well, before he can divert 3 of his days to putting together this net, what's he going to have to do first? He's going to have to either reduce his consumption of berries so as to store up some that he can eat while he's working on the net, or he's going to have to work overtime and just gather a whole bunch of extra berries to sustain him during that 3-day period when all he's doing is working on the net. So we understand then that what economists have sometimes referred to as a subsistence fund, namely the berries that will sustain Robinson Crusoe during the period of time that he's working on his capital good, namely a net. A capital good is in effect something you use to produce consumer goods. Well, the net is going to net him, so to speak, some fish, which are consumer goods for him. The subsistence fund is the berries that sustain him during this time-consuming production process. And without those berries, he would have to stop the process prematurely because, he'd be on the verge of starvation. Now let's extrapolate to an economy with 2 people in it. So we've got, let's say, a baker and a blacksmith. And let's say the blacksmith decides that he actually is a better inventor than he is a blacksmith. He's going to cease doing blacksmith activity, and he's instead going to work on an invention. Well, he can only work on the invention if there are enough saved resources in the economy to sustain him while he's inventing. Because while he's inventing, he's not producing consumer goods. So the baker in this 2-person economy had better be saving some extra bread in order to sustain the inventor. He can borrow this bread, and then when his invention comes to light and he makes $1 million, then he pays it back. But in other words, only real stuff, only actual loaves of bread could sustain this inventor. So that is to say, we can now draw a general conclusion from what we've seen in a single-person economy and a 2-person economy, because what is true of these primitive economies is true on a larger scale of a modern economy, and that is, if you withdraw productive factors, like, for example, labor, if you withdraw them from the production of consumer goods, as when Crusoe sat back for 3 days and didn't gather berries, or when the blacksmith decided to be an inventor instead of doing blacksmith activity, when you withdraw productive factors from the production of consumer goods, there has to be a corresponding amount of saving, real stuff saved in the economy, to sustain people who are not, in fact, producing consumer goods anymore. So that, in other words, the supply of consumer goods is going to shrink. Well, in order to allow everybody to go on living, in order for this to be possible, the rest of society needs to have saved, needs to have cut its consumption, as when Robinson Crusoe cut his consumption of berries in order to be able to see him through his time-consuming production process. So the interest rate makes sure that we don't all start, let's say, switching jobs into research and development, which research and development isn't going to yield you something for like 10 years. Where are we going to get the food? Where are we going to get the stuff to sustain somebody who's going to be working for 10 years not producing anything? That's going to have to come from prior saving. Green pieces of paper printed up out of thin air cannot sustain this person. Because if the real stuff, if actual saved loaves of bread, for instance, have not been created, you can print all the green pieces of paper you want, but when I go to buy stuff with them, there won't be anything to buy. Or they'll be infinitely expensive. So you understand that in order to engage in the production of capital goods, long-term projects, there has to be voluntary saving on the part of the public in advance to make this possible, to provide a subsistence fund to see society through during the waiting period until these projects finally bear fruit in the form of an increase in consumption goods.